Hey guys, are you or someone you know looking for a tax shelter? A movie is an excellent investment since you sink as much money as you want into it. I have a film in development entitled Living Amongst the Civilized, a movie I've written and will be directing. It is based on a true story, the life of Krista Andrews, a friend of mine. There are many films about male rebels. What about the bad girls? That's an underrepresented group. Krista Andrews has been an outlaw who has lived life on her own terms, often at variance with mainstream society. She has faced many consequences, but regret is not one of them. Look for Living Amongst the Civilized at Indiegogo.com. If you know somebody who is sick and tired of being taxed to death, this is a worthwhile opportunity. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
Why do you seem so scared? All I wanted to do was play with you. Please come and play with me. I'm so lonely. You're not afraid of the dark, are you? Don't be afraid. Come with me. I will show you where I play hide and seek. Do you want to play hide and seek? You hide, and I'll find you.
Torture can occur both in the private and public realm. This podcast has handled many cases of the torture of children and adults who have suffered torture in myriad forms. From the micro to the macro, torture has a long history of being employed by governments and royalty to extract information and to punish those perceived as being disloyal and/or transgressive. Many activists consider torture to be not only inhumane, but ineffective, since the victim is likely to say whatever the torturer wants to hear to put an end to their suffering. This episode details the methods of torture used throughout the ages. I'm going to begin with methods of torture. Method 1. Burning and branding. From ancient Rome until the 1700s, a hot iron was used to burn an inscription into a conflict's flesh. This was considered to be a valid way to ensure that they would continue to suffer punishment, since the scar would advertise them as a miscreant to respectable society. The brand was typically applied to their hand or face. This would ensure they would never have a chance to turn a new leaf. When someone appeared in court, they were required to hold up their hand so that the officials would know if they were previously convicted. This is when the practice of raising a hand when being sworn in for testimony began. The type of branding and the location of the body it was applied to varied by nation and crime. Rome branded recaptured slaves who had escaped with an F for fugitives. In the 1700s, England punished those who spoke out against the government with an SL, which stood for seditious libeler. A rogue's hand was branded with an R. A thief got a T. Liars were branded with the letter F for falsehood. Vagabonds were marked with a V. If you perjured yourself, they would burn a P into your forehead. If you took the Lord's name in vain, you would receive a B on your forehead, which stood for blasphemer. If you were a military deserter, you would be branded with a D in both armpits. Soldiers whose conduct were considered unacceptable would receive a BC for bad conduct in their armpits. Many countries branded offenders in this way, though commensurate with their alphabet and language. The French would go as far as to burn a convict's sentence in their skin. Boring with a hot iron. Boring with a hot iron was not like branding. There was no insignia or word to be burned into one's flesh. It was just a hole that was burned into some part of the offender's body with a hot iron, similar to a fireplace poker. If you were a liar, perjurer, or blasphemer, a hole would be burned through your tongue. If you were a petty thief or a drunkard, a hole would be pierced into one or both of your ears. The Brazen Bowl. The Brazen Bowl was unique to the ancient Sicilian city-state of Acragas, which is now known as Agrigentum. This technique was favored by the tyrant Phalaris. It was a hollow, life-sized statue of a bowl. On its side was a door large enough to stuff a man into the statue. Once the victim was securely in place with the trapdoor locked, a fire was lit beneath the statue. The fire would heat it until it was red hot. The man within would scream, and the sounds would be heard from the open mouth and nostrils of the statue. The screams were said to resemble the sound of an enraged bull. Burning. Burning people at the stake was a popular torture and death tactic throughout history, and it is still being employed today in some areas. The practice found its most widespread acceptance and practice during the era of the witch hunts, which took place from the early 1500s through to the late 1600s. The individuals who were burned were considered to have transgressed against the Christian God and its associated religions. They would be condemned for heresy or consorting with Satan. The burning was perceived as being the only way to purge the evil from their souls. According to the way that the religious and civil authorities felt at the time, it was better for the body to suffer than for the soul to be condemned to eternal damnation. Burn now or burn forever. The person being burned didn't always suffer the tortures of immolation, however. Quite often they were strangled to death before they were burned. Ironic, considering that their religion specifically condemns the act of murder. To quote Genesis 9:6, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." These moral authorities felt they were exempt from the seventh commandment under special circumstances. Witches or women who were suspected of being witches were frequently burned. One loophole in the Bible that was exploited for this purpose was a line from Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." It wasn't just witches who suffered this fate, however. Sometimes a Christian who did not practice what was considered the superior religion would be condemned. For example, Reverend Dr. John Hooper, Bishop of Gloucester, was condemned for refusing to convert from the Church of England to Roman Catholicism. Whoever was considered to be so corrupted and depraved as to deserve to be burned, they were deemed too evil to be accepted back into society. Even exile was perceived as too merciful. The methodology was very simple. The condemned person was led to the location where a mound of brushwood and bundles of twigs and logs were piled around a large wooden stake. The victim and a guard mounted the pyre. The victim was then chained to the stake. To negate any possibility of fire resistance, their clothes were smeared with grease, oil, or tar. Before the pyre was set afire, a priest asked the condemned to affirm their faith in God. He would offer them a cross to kiss. Whether they took him up on this offer or not, the command would be given that the fire should be ignited. If the fire did not burn effectively at first, perhaps due to wood that was collected from healthy plants and therefore not dry, the priest would say the following prayer: "Lord Jesus, have mercy upon me. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." The face would roast until it was black. The tongue would swell until they could no longer scream. The lips sunk back and attached to the gums. Fat, water, and blood dripped out of the fingertips. The body would burn and burn and burn until it was reduced to ashes. Execution and cremation completed with one procedure. Burning sulfur. Burning sulfur consisted of placing a lump of sulfur under one or both armpits of an offender and setting it on fire. Sulfur burns with such fury that even water cannot extinguish the flames. Major veins and arteries are embedded beneath the arms. So not only was this form of torture extremely painful, but it was often fatal. The cauldron. This method was devised by the Spanish Inquisition. Several mice or one or two rats were placed on the victim's stomach. A large cauldron was placed upside down on the stomach, trapping the rodents. A charcoal fire would be lit on the upturned bottom of the pot and would burn until it was red hot. Desperate to escape from the heat, the rodents would claw and chew their way into the victim's stomach, seeking it as their only refuge from suffocation and immolation. They would then bore through the offender's intestines, searching for an escape route. Frying and roasting. From ancient Assyria until the 1700s in France, people have been tossed into gigantic frying pans and seared like steak. The Roman chronicler Gallonio described one particular incident during Emperor Nero's persecution of the Christians from 64 to 68 AD. The frying pan was filled with oil, pitch, or resin, and then set over a fire. And when it began to boil and bubble, then were the Christians of either sex thrown into it, to the end that they might be roasted and fried like fishes. Sometimes the Romans would roast one of the victims on a gridiron, essentially a gigantic barbecue grill. During the Spanish Inquisition, the Spaniards would put their victims into huge pans and slide them into ovens, where they would be roasted alive. Hot wire. The Mongol emperors of India came up with their own innovation of the torture by burning technique. They would bind the victim's thumbs, fingers, or hands with hot wires. Once the wire was in place and burning effectively, it was then doused with cold water. This would cause it to contract and cut even deeper into flesh and bone. The Spanish chair. Thank your lucky stars that you didn't experience the Spanish Inquisition. Another technique developed by the Inquisition was the Spanish chair, which appeared harmless enough at first glance. It was usually just a typical wicker garden chair. The difference was that it was made entirely out of iron. The open spaces of the back seat and between the arms and legs were filled with chain mail and metal restraints at the wrists, ankles, and chest. Sometimes the chain mail was fitted with sharp spikes that dug into the victim's flesh. Having been bound, the pain was compounded either by placing a brazier of hot coals under the seat, or the feet would be exposed to a live fire. They didn't want the feet to burn away too quickly. They wanted to savor the victim's agony. To prolong the burning and pain, they might baste the feet with oil or fat. Trial by fire or water. This method was also known as trial by ordeal. It was done to determine whether or not a person was guilty of a crime. The feeling held by the society that allowed this method to be used was that the outcome would be determined by God. When it came to trial by fire, the accused was required to walk barefoot over between 3 to 9 red-hot plowshares. They would pick up a glowing hot iron bar and walk 3 paces, or place their hand inside of a hot glove of chain mail. Once it was over, the burned part of the body was salved with ointment and wrapped in a linen bandage. 3 days later, the bandage was removed. If there were no blisters, the accused was deemed innocent. Visible blisters adjudged the victim as guilty. Trial by water involved the accused plunging their hands, which were sometimes swathed in protective layers of linen cloth, into a vat of boiling water, with the objective of removing a large stone from the bottom of the pot. Afterwards, the hands were salved and bandaged, and examined after 3 days, with the verdict delivered in a similar way to the trial by fire. Boots. The earliest known use of this technique was documented in 1590. It was used in Britain, Europe, and the Orient for centuries. In Britain and Europe, the boot was an iron boot-shaped shell, custom designed to fit over the foot and lower leg of the victim. Once the boot was in place, wooden wedges were driven between the boot and leg until the limb was crushed. It was crushed to such a degree that blood, muscle, and even bone marrow oozed from the cracks and out from the top of the boot. If the torturer was feeling especially sadistic, the boot would be applied while red hot, searing the flesh before the crushing commenced. In India, the boot would consist of 2 boards lashed to either side of the victim's foot. The ropes were twisted so tight that the ankle bones, with the rest of the foot to follow, were crushed. Method 2. Crushing, smashing, and breaking. Breaking on the wheel. The wheel was either a standard type taken from an ox cart or wagon. Sometimes it was custom designed. Either way, it was mounted on a low pole or axle, which was implanted in the ground. The wheel and support pole resembled a circular picnic table. The victim would be tied in a spread eagle position. A crowd would assemble and cheer as the executioner tortured the victim to death. Among the many tortures applied, including stripping large pieces of flesh from the body with pincers shaped like pliers, which were sometimes heated red hot. That, or every joint and limb would be broken with iron bars or wooden mallets. The hands, feet, arms, and legs could be severed with an axe. Once it was certain that the victim was at death's door, the executioner would cut their head off. When the Romans used this method, they would use a wide, drum-like wheel mounted about a foot from the ground on an A-frame, leaving it to resemble a Ferris wheel. The outside of the wheel would be set with multiple spikes. The victim's face would be tied to the spikes. Underneath the wheel, mounted to the ground, was another set of spikes. The wheel would be spun, and the victim would be ground to pieces between the 2 sets of spikes. Brodican. This method was invented and used by the French. The Brodican was a shallow, 3-sided box, or trough. It was made to fit securely around a man's legs so that they were pressed tightly together. The legs were then tied with rope to secure them further. From there, wooden wedges were driven between the victim's knees and ankle balls. The delicate bone ends would be shattered as a result. Additional wedges were frequently driven directly into the soft tissue of the thighs and around the shins. Pillywinks. Along with haggis and the bagpipes, this was a method of torture contributed by the Scottish to the world, though it was only employed in Scotland. This device was designed to crush the fingers. It caused the fingers of one hand to be bent palmward from the rearmost joint, and they were held in a flat position. The device was then slowly tightened to the point that the fingers were crushed. It was uniformly described as a grievous torture. Good luck playing the bagpipes after that. Pressing. Pressing was a technique to elicit a confession from a suspect. Under medieval law, a full confession was required so that the government could confiscate the property of the convicted. Without the confession, their property would remain with their family, even if they were found guilty. The procedure was described by the official act that mandated it by law. The prisoner shall be remanded to the place from whence he came, and put in some low dark room. There he shall lie without any litter or anything under him, and that one arm shall be drawn to one quarter of the room with a cord, and the other to another, and that his feet shall be used in the same manner, and that as many weights shall be laid on him as he can bear, and more. That he shall have no sustenance but the worst bread and water, and that he shall not eat the same day on which he drinks, not drink on the same day on which he eats, and so he shall continue till he die. Suspects with more willpower than most would hold out until their ribs were crushed. One example was Margaret Clitheroe. In 1586, she was accused of providing sanctuary for a Jesuit priest. After 15 minutes of pressing, when almost 900 pounds were piled on her, her ribs literally exploded through her sides. In another case, a man was crushed under the weight during the Salem witch trials of 1692. His name was Giles Corey, and he was pressed to death for refusing to confess to the practice of witchcraft. In 1776, the year of America's birth, Thomas Spigot endured more than a week of increasing weights. He became delirious and assumed that the weights were producing the crushing sensation. In reality, it was just the increase in blood pressure that caused the pain in his head. He agreed to confess once 400 pounds had been piled on top of the door laid on his back. India created its own version of this. 2 stout bamboo poles were tied to the front and back of a victim's chest. With the aid of ropes, they would be pulled tighter and tighter until the ribs were crushed. Not only would the victim confess, but they were maimed to such a degree that a slow and painful death was guaranteed. Scavenger's daughter. This device was invented by Leonard Skeffington, whose name was later corrupted into Scavenger. He was lieutenant of the Tower of London during the reign of Henry VIII. The device was made of iron bars that were roughly formed into the shape of an uppercase A. There was a loop at the top large enough to be locked around a victim's neck. There were also 2 loops at the midpoint, approximately where the crossbar of the A would be, and they manacled the wrists, and 2 more loops as the lower ends of the A where the victim's knees could be locked. The device was short enough that the body was required to be bent forward beyond what it could tolerate. To achieve this, the torture master's assistant would straddle the victim and press down upon his shoulders before the victim could be locked into it. The chest was forced to the knees and the stomach to the thighs until the victim was doubled tightly into a ball. Because the spine cannot withstand this much extension, blood would gush from the victim's nose, ears, and mouth. If they were left in this position for a few minutes, the spine would be permanently dislocated, and the breastbone and ribs would be fractured. Schneiden. This device was invented in Germany. It was also known as the Crons. Its first recorded use was in 1530. Basically, it was a jaw-crushing machine. It consisted of an iron skull cap held in place with a heavy leather chin strap. Once this was put in place, the strap would be tightened with a ratchet. If it was pulled tight enough, the victim's teeth would be shattered. His jaw was broken to pieces, and the pressure on his skull so intense it felt as if his head would explode. Should it tickle his fancy at the time, the torture master might decide to amuse himself by tapping on the metal cap with a small hammer. Thumb screws. The objective with thumb screws was to place incremental amounts of pressure on the knuckles of both thumbs simultaneously. The thumbs were inserted into an M-shaped frame made of iron or wood. They would be locked into place with a bottom plate, which was screwed into place with a small crank or wing nut. As the nut was turned, the lower plate pushed ever harder on the thumbs, squeezing them against the top bar of the frame. When the victim agreed to give the answers that were expected of them, the pressure was released. If they refused to cooperate, the pressure would be increased until the knuckles were shattered. In India, a similar device was created. which crushed the fingers of the accused between bamboo rods. If this wasn't deemed painful enough, the fingers of one hand were bound tightly together with cord and bamboo wedges, driven between the knuckles of the fingers, slicing through flesh, tendon, and bone. The knuckles and fingers would be crushed. Method 3. Cutting, piercing, tearing, and impaling. Amputation. From the dawn of recorded history, criminals and enemies of the state often had parts of their bodies severed as a punishment for their transgressions, and also as a warning to those who were considering breaking the same rules. Ears, noses, lips, hands, feet, and entire legs were chopped off for the amusement of the viewing public. The victim would be maimed to such a degree that they were unable to earn an honest living. In medieval France, felons were frequently sentenced to having their feet amputated. A thief would lose their left ear for a first offense. The right would be cut off for a second offense. For a third, they would be executed in toto. Under the rule of King Louis XII, who reigned from 1498 to 1515, anyone guilty of 8 counts of blasphemy would have their tongue cut out. Under the rule of English King Canute, who reigned from 995 to 1035, adulterous women would have their noses and ears cut off. Henry VIII facilitated the most elaborate ceremonies when it came to public amputations. The sergeant of the woodyard brought the chopping block and cords. They would keep the prisoner's hand in place. The master cook handed the knife to the sergeant of the larder, who would cut off the victim's hand. The sergeant of poultry cut the head off a chicken, and the body would be shoved over the stump to prevent infection. The yeoman of the scullery attended to the fire that the sergeant farrier used to heat his searing irons. After the hand was cut off, the chief surgeon took the searing iron from the sergeant farrier and cauterized the wound. The sergeant of poultry shoved the dead bird over the stump, and the wound was bandaged by the chief surgeon. The sergeant of the pantry offered the victim bread, while the sergeant of the cellar poured him a nice cup of wine. Queen Elizabeth I, also known as Good Queen Bess, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, ordered the hands of sheep rustlers, people who steal sheep, to be amputated. The barrel. A cask or barrel would have long spikes driven through it. Once this was accomplished, the victim was placed inside and the barrel would be rolled down a hill or thrown into the ocean. Beheading. Off with his head is a line we've heard in many fictional depictions of medieval justice. Most executions used an axe, but the French used a sword. The sword was less messy and more efficient. They had a point. Legendary executioner Jack Ketch sometimes had to take 3 or 4 swings to complete the job with an axe. Others tried to instill even more efficiency into the procedure by mechanizing. Leave it to the Germans to invent a beheading machine around 1300. It was apparently quite effective, as it was adopted by the Italians, Irish, and the English. The most famous of the beheading machines is the guillotine. It was adopted by the French in 1785. Its towering crossbeams and swiftly descending blade became a fetish symbol of sorts in French culture during the French Revolution and the following Reign of Terror. The last guillotine was taken out of service in 1946 when France closed down a notorious prison colony known as Devil's Island. The Blood Eagle. This procedure was practiced by the Vikings. It was used to prove to the victim that they were dead serious. The victim was usually either a chieftain or some other local authority figure. They would be stripped to the waist and bent forward. Following this, their ribs were hacked from their backbone. After this, the executioner detached their lungs, though they did not rip them loose. The victim died a few hours later. Their body was given the appearance of having flapping, bloody wings, like an eagle. flaying. Ostensibly, this amounts to being skinned alive. The earliest known record of this practice dates at around 1100 AD and as late as 1366. The victim was tied to a square frame and hung upside down in a spread eagle position. The executioner would wring their ankles with a sharp knife and make an incision down the inner surface of each leg. They would wring the genitals and continue the slit down their stomach and chest. Starting at the ankles, the skin was stripped away from the victim, similar to the way a hunter skins an animal after killing it. Once the skin was peeled to the stomach, the intestines would fall out and over the victim's face. Once they were stripped of all their skin, they were left to die of shock and blood loss. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. This torture was prescribed to those who were convicted of treason around the time of Henry III's rule in the 1200s. The convict was laid upon a sledge or hurdle and drawn to the gallows or other place of execution. They would be hanged by the neck until they were halfway to death. If they passed out, they would be awakened by having a bucket of water thrown onto their face. They didn't want him to miss out on any pain that was coming his way. They would then be cut down. The genitals were cut off and tossed into a fire, demonstrating that traitors would not be allowed to reproduce. The executioner would reach into the trunk of the body while the victim was still screaming and pull out his heart. He would hold it aloft for the benefit of the audience and declare, "Behold, the heart of a traitor." The entrails were cut from their body and burned by the executioner. The head would then be chopped off. The victim was usually kept conscious until either the heart or head was severed. The rest of his body would be divided into quarters. The head and quarters were put on display as directed. They would be parboiled with bay leaves and cumin seed as preservatives. They were given a coating of tar before being placed on a pike and used to decorate town gates and bridges throughout the kingdom. Sometimes they were left for years or even decades, whereupon they were reduced to bones. Heretic's fork. The heretic's fork was attached to the victim's neck with an implement that resembled a leather dog collar. Two large table forks were attached at right angles. One fork stuck into the chin, and the other rested at the hollow of the bottom of the throat, where it meets the collarbone. If the victim attempted to lower or raise their head in any way, the tines of the fork would pierce their flesh deeply, impaling the tongue and digging into the throat. The tines weren't long enough to kill the subject. They were just positioned to inflict intense pain. It made sleep impossible. Impaling. Devices suitable for impaling someone were not complex in design. All that was needed was a pole stout enough to hold the victim's body. The subject was placed on the ground or a table, and the pole would be rammed up his rectum far enough to ensure he was secured, but not far enough to rip his head off. The pole with the offender impaled on it would be driven into a hole in the ground. It was left this way so that spectators could have a look if they pleased. Food, folks, and fun. If the executioner missed his heart, the victim would stay alive, screaming from the excruciating pain for hours that felt like years. The most famous practitioner of this method was Prince Vlad II of Wallachia, who reigned from 1448 to 1476. He was also known as Vlad Dracula and, of course, Vlad the Impaler. Vlad delighted in every opportunity to practice this art. He would even decorate the no-go zones around his castle with the corpses of thousands of Turkish adversaries. Eventually, the Turks saw no necessity in paying any visits to his homestead. Iron Maiden. Yes, it is the name of one of the premier bands of the so-called new wave of British heavy metal. If you find their music to be torturous, you wouldn't be able to cope with the agony of being placed into the torture device of their namesake. It was invented by the Germans in the 1400s. It was shaped like an Egyptian mummy case. The design of its outer shell was fashioned after the shape of a woman's body. That is where the beauty stopped. Beneath its aesthetically appealing exterior were spikes measured between 4 and 6 inches. The victim was pushed into the case, and the door was closed over them. They would be pierced from head to toe. The purpose was not to kill them on contact. The spikes were carefully measured to ensure unendurable pain, but not with the relief of death to follow. The spikes pierced deeply, but not to the heart. There was a large industry around the Iron Maiden, with manufacturing producing thousands of units. Some were designed with larger spikes for those who wished to use it for execution, in which case the spikes were designed to cut into the eyes and brain. Ling Chi. This is a method invented by the Chinese, whose name, roughly translated, is the death by 1,000 cuts. The agonizing pain suffered during this method lingers for a long time, and the pain is unrelenting. It is considered to have been one of the most excruciating torture methods ever devised. The victim was tied to a table while the executioner entered with a cloth-covered basket. The basket did not contain the offender's last meal. Only knives were served up. Every knife bore a symbol representing individual portions of the body. The knives were selected at random, like bingo numbers, and the knife chosen would be used to slice off the corresponding body part. Depending on the body parts chosen, the torture could go on for hours and hours and hours. It ended with the knife whose inscription indicated the heart. If the victim was fortunate enough monetarily, his family would bribe the executioner to use the heart knife first and make the procedure as quick and painless as possible. In Japan, predating the high quality and efficiency of Sony, a similar procedure was performed, except it was called death by 21 cuts. The pass, or cradle. This device was similar to the Iron Maiden, and was used in towns that could not afford an Iron Maiden. It looked like an oversized baby's cradle. It was a large rectangular wooden box with rockers attached to the bottom. The interior was lined with sharpened iron spikes. The victim would be stripped naked and lowered into it. Once they were in place, the cradle was rocked back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, into excruciating pain, and then death. The pendulum, another innovation in pain developed by the Spanish Inquisition. This form of torture is as psychologically arduous as it is physically painful and fatal. A large blade was swung back and forth above the subject for a lengthy period of time. The blade would advance closer and closer and closer to the victim's body as time went on, until it cut through him gradually, torturing him with excruciating pain until his demise was assured. Pincers. This was a very simple procedure that consisted of using a tool resembling pliers. They were heated red hot to maximize discomfort. From there, the pincers were used to strip flesh from the victim's body. The French used this technique, and if they were in an especially sadistic mood, they would torment the victim further by dousing them with boiling wax or hot lead. Pricking. Women who were suspected of practicing witchcraft suffered this torture. An iron needle mounted on the end of a wooden handle would be used to prick her flesh. There were areas of her body designated at the time as the so-called stigmata sagarum. It was said that, due to interventions by Satan, these areas were impervious to pain. It is true, however, that there are parts of the body that have very few nerve endings, particularly on the back. If a victim was jabbed enough, their nervous system could not withstand the shock, and it would shut down. The saw. The saw was designed specifically for severing human body parts. The procedure was performed in such a way as to ensure it was as slow and painful as possible. When the victim was hung upside down, the executioner or torturer would cut them in half at the groin. Because there was enough blood and oxygen flowing to the brain, the victim would remain alive to suffer until the saw cut into their lungs or heart. Scalping. In modern culture, scalping is mostly associated with Aboriginal cultures of North America. The practice actually predates recorded history. The first documented uses of this method were employed by Canute, the Viking king of southern England. Centuries later, the French revived this technique as they attempted to wipe out every English settlement in the New World. They taught scalping to the Aboriginal peoples, and after their training they were paid on a per-head basis. After all, scalps are easier to transport than entire human heads. Scalping is not always fatal. Sometimes the victim would live, but they were forced to regularly apply oil to the top of their skull to keep it from drying out. Method 3. Torture by restraint. The anchor. This was a restraint device used on prisoners to force them into a humiliating posture of submission, wherein they would be bent forward into a posture that was beyond the spine's capabilities to withstand. They were kept in this position in damp dungeons for long periods of time. Sometimes it resulted in permanent injury and deformity to the spine. Bilbos. Bilbos were ankle shackles attached at opposite ends of an 18-inch iron bar. This was installed to prevent a prisoner from escaping. A chain would be attached from the bilbos to a post or wall to keep them in place. Binding. This is a very simple matter of using a rope to restrain the subject, though different societies have employed their own variations. In India, convicts would be bound in unnatural postures, like with one leg tied to their opposite shoulder and pulled as tightly as possible. They might also pull a rope against their throat and pull it down their back and tie it to their ankles. If they even attempted to move, they would be strangled. Henry VIII, ever the torture fan, ordered a court minstrel by the name of Mark Smeaton to be bound because of dallying with Queen Anne Boleyn. Smeaton's head was encircled with a knotted rope. The knots were arranged so that they were positioned over his eyes. The ropes were twisted so tightly, the pressure compressed his eyes until they exploded. The Spanish Inquisition had their own version. They would bind a victim's thumbs together with a small cord. They wrapped them so tightly that blood would spurt from beneath the thumbnails. The Garrett. Death by strangulation. In medieval Spain, this practice became a standard form of execution for every type of criminal. The garrote was a small stool attached to a short post. The victim was bound hand and foot and seated on a stool before a metal collar which was attached to the post and fixed around their neck. At the rear of the collar was a crank or screw, which would tighten the victim's neck as it was turned. The subject's neck would be slowly pulled onto a metal spike that protruded from the post. Though the purpose of this design was to puncture the cervical vertebrae, typically the victim was simply strangled to death. The iron collar. The iron collar was attached to the end of a length of chain, which was attached to a ring mounted into the wall of a dungeon or prison cell. It would both keep a prisoner in place, but would also be used to haul them from one location to another if necessary. Sometimes the collar would be fastened too tightly, and if the prisoner rolled out of bed, they were likely to strangle themselves. Another variation of this was known as the jungs in Holland. The collar was attached in the same way, but it was installed in a church wall or a local market cross, so that religious transgressors would be publicly humiliated for their sins. The Little Ease. The Little Ease was a prison cell so small that the convict had no room to stand up or lie down. They were forced into a permanent crouching position. The Porto. Once again, the Spanish Inquisition came up with another innovative form of torture. The Porto was a wooden bed shaped like a rack. A series of holes were drilled in strategic locations. When the convict was laid out on the bed, ropes were threaded through the holes on either side of both arms and either side of the thighs. With the aid of a windlass, the ropes were pulled so tight they dug through the victim's flesh and muscle tissue. Sometimes they tore straight to the bone. Another variation of this was to have the ropes attached to the wall instead of the wooden bed. The prisoner would be seated on a small stool, and the ropes were threaded through wall-mounted iron rings, which were situated where the hands, arms, and waist would be positioned. When the ropes were pulled tightly enough, the stool would be kicked away, and the prisoner would dangle from the wall until they were willing to cooperate. The wooden horse. This torture was part of the package the Spanish Inquisition referred to as the tormento de toca, or torture by water. It was a shallow box, similar to a trough, and it was large enough for a man to lie in. It was either fitted with legs or placed on a table. At the location of the victim's waist, an iron bar extended from one side to the other. When the man was placed in the wooden horse, the bar rested into the small of his back. This prevented him from lying flat on the bottom of the box. The victim would then be securely bound with small ropes, threaded through holes in the bottom of the box. Ropes would be placed around the arms, thighs, and shins, and then pulled so tightly, sometimes with the aid of cranks, that they would cut through his flesh almost to the bone. From this point, the torturer might decide to employ some form of water torture. Method 4. Torture by public display, shame, and humiliation. The auto de fe. This was a public ceremony devised by the Spanish Inquisition, where the condemned party and those who had repented their heresies were forced to pray through the streets of their township in large processions. They bore signs that advertised their transgressions. The ones who recanted and were spared the burning post wore inverted flames sewn to the backs of their gowns. Those who were to be burnt wore upright flames. Once the parade arrived at the appointed location, the assembly participated in a religious service. From there, the condemned were handed over to secular authorities to be put through an instantaneous justice mill before being tied to a burning post and set on fire. The branks, masks of shame or infamy. The branks were used between the 1500s and the 1800s. They were used to punish people who verbally transgressed against prevailing social conventions. Innumerable women decried as scolds and shrews, who were reduced to domestic slavery and endless pregnancy, were punished for neurasthenia, or weakness of the nerves, and frenzy. They were therefore humiliated and tortured. The politicians did this to ridicule the petty disobedient and non-conforming sectors of the population. The majority of the victims were always women. The operative principle was, let the woman be silent in church. Church included the ruling ecclesiastical and secular hierarchies. They were both constitutionally misogynistic, hence the variation of, let the woman be silent in the presence of the male. The victims would be locked into the masks and staked out in the town square. The crowd would abuse them. They were beaten and besmeared with feces and urine. Sometimes they were mortally wounded, especially in the breasts, anus, and vagina. The Kang. This device was invented by the Chinese. It was a large wooden collar worn by the condemned to display their transgression in public for a prescribed period of time. The collar was built with two sections held in place with a hinge. This enabled the collar to open and admit the prisoner. The collar was then closed and locked in place. The victim was unable to lie down, walk, or even stand without the risk of breaking his neck. He also wouldn't be able to reach his mouth to eat or drink. If he was lucky, a bystander might be compassionate enough to offer him refreshments. The Chucking Stool. This device was invented sometime before the Norman conquest of 1066. The English invented this humiliation just for women. These women were unable to control their sharp tongues. To quote a historian from that time, the Chucking Stool was a seat of infamy, where strumpets and scolds, with bared feet and head, were condemned to abide the gibes of those who passed by. The stool was a wooden armchair mounted on two poles, similar to an open sedan chair popular in the 18th century. A hole was cut into the bottom of the chair, and the victim's skirts were hoisted up. Her exposed backside was visible for all to see while she was paraded through the streets. The drunkard's cloak. This device was devised by King James I of England. It was a large beer keg with the bottom knocked out and a hole cut into the top large enough to pass a man's head through. Anybody convicted of habitual public inebriation was forced to wear it whenever they went out in public. Sometimes holes were cut into the sides so the victim could use their hands to support the barrel's weight. To prevent the victim from stepping out of the cloak, a locking collar of wood or metal would be placed around their neck. The barrel would cause a lot of chafing, and the weight could easily tear the muscles connecting the neck to the shoulders. The Fiddle and Flute. This was a portable or mobile pillory. After the victim was locked into it, they could be paraded through the streets while being led by a chain and collar around their necks. In some cases, they were trapped in it before they were exiled from the city. They were at the mercy of all bystanders. They would also be incapable of feeding themselves and were forced to rely on the charity of onlookers, if they were so inclined. This punishment was usually meted out to women of a shrewish temperament. Penance. Those who transgressed against the church or society in the Middle Ages were forced to atone for their sins. This penance could be as minor as a short period of fasting and prayer. It could also consist of taking a pilgrimage to a holy site. It took a morbid and macabre turn in France on one occasion. A man was found guilty of murdering his infant child. He was sentenced to chaining the child to his back and walking all the way to Rome, under strict supervision by a priest and armed guards. His ultimate fate during this trip is unknown. The Fingerpillary. This device was used to punish people who disrupted church services. The Fingerpillary consisted of two boards that were hinged together and attached to the wall of a church. One of the boards had 4 holes drilled through it. They were spaced to accept a person's fingers. In the opposite board were 4 corresponding grooves, or troughs, that closed over the fingers. The hope was that once the hand was locked in place, the subject would be more attentive to the word of God. The Pillary. This is a device where the condemned had their head and wrists locked into a wooden frame that was mounted on a post at shoulder height. It was set up in a public space, like a local market square. Their head and hands poked through the front of the pillory. It was a punishment for those convicted of minor crimes, such as public inebriation, fist-fighting, homosexuality, or disorderly conduct. It was also used for such commercial violations as selling putrid meat, stinking fish, rotting birds, and bread with pieces of iron contained within to increase its weight. In the old Dutch colony of New York, a man convicted of stealing cabbages would be sent to the pillory with a cabbage tied to his head, and it was a public spectacle. Depending on the severity of their offense, onlookers might pelt them with rotten vegetables, mud, and stones. Sometimes the abuse was so extreme they were knocked unconscious and were at risk of being strangled to death when the full weight of their bodies pressed down on their neck. One recorded incident had James Egan and James Salmon being pelted with stones, potatoes, bricks, and dead animals. Riding the Stang. Men who beat their wives and got into fights at taverns would be placed on a log or stout pole. They were to straddle it while being carried through the streets of his town. People would shout at him, blow horns, and catcall him to ensure he was thoroughly embarrassed. Another variation was known as the Spanish donkey. This was a wooden horse, sometimes with wheels and sometimes with rockers, and it would have a spiked seat, or maybe even have a V-shaped wedge. The offender would be forced to straddle the contraption with their arms tied behind their back. They would ride it while others rocked or wheeled them around. To add extra suffering, weights were attached to their feet. The scolds bridle. This was another device created to punish sharp-tongued women. It was used in Britain and Europe during the Middle Ages. It consisted of a helmet-like cage made of iron straps. It was locked over the woman's head. On many occasions, she would be led through the streets, where she would be subjected to catcalls and shouts of derision. If the torturer felt especially malicious, he might force a metal tongue or ball into her mouth to gag her screams or curses. Signs of shame. This was a more humane form of branding. The public humiliation consisted of the offender wearing a sign that indicated what kind of crime they committed. For example, public drunkenness might incur the punishment of walking the streets bearing a sign that read, "Drunkard." Stocks. Similar in structure and purpose to the pillory, the stocks were wooden restraints that were hinged. The offender's ankles were locked within it. The convict was fastened into it in public so that passers-by could inflict their own tortures upon them. The point was to teach people a lesson in good manners and honesty. The French came up for a way to make this torture not only humiliating but painful. The bottoms of the victim's feet were doused with brine. A goat would be allowed to lick them. A goat's tongue is as rough as sandpaper. After a few minutes of licking, each lap would deliver a lashing of excruciating pain, which was apparently very amusing to the spectators. This left us with the expression, being made a laughingstock. Method 5, torture by stretching and suspension. Crucifixion. This is the most famous form of torture. Though it is known for bringing about the demise of Jesus Christ during the heyday of the Roman Empire, it was also used by ancient Hebrew cultures. Gerucha, another invention of the Spanish Inquisition. What this consisted of was a convict's hands were bound behind their back. A rope running from the wrists was threaded through a pulley, which was attached to the ceiling or a crossbeam. Once the rope was hauled in, the prisoner was lifted into the air while their arms were slowly yanked from their shoulders' sockets. Sometimes the pain was taken to further extremes by attaching weights to the feet, which weighed anywhere from 100 to 250 pounds. They might even be repeatedly lifted and dropped to the floor, possibly landing on a mound of sharp rocks. The gibbet. The gibbet was a cage made of iron straps. It was invented in the 16th century. The intention was to display corpses after the victim was hanged. The idea was to provide a warning to anybody who was considering committing a similar transgression. In the absence of a proper gibbet, the corpse might have just been hung from a tree by chains. The victim was often left in the gibbet long after they died. Travelers would use gibbets as landmarks. An English traveler recalled a visit to Germany in the early 1600s when they happened upon a gibbet. Near Lindau, I see a malefactor hanging in iron chains in the gallows, with a massive dog hanging on each side by the heels, as being nearly starved. They might eat the flesh of the malefactor before he himself died of famine. Hanging. Though hanging was usually employed as a method of execution, one technique emerged called the drop method. A trapdoor in the floor of the gallows would open, and the victim would fall approximately 6 feet. Their neck would be broken, and they would be left to dangle and smart from the excruciating pain. The rack. The rack was a flat wooden bed. The convict would be laid out on it, and the pain was inflicted by tying the victim's feet to one end of the device while their hands were wound around a large windlass by ropes located at the other end. As the windlass was turned, the rope would be cranked in. The victim's limbs would be stretched to the point that the arms could be dislocated from their sockets. That, or the spine was disjointed. If the torturer wanted to savor every moment of it, the victim would be tortured in small sessions of 10 or 15 minutes at a time, and never more than twice a day. That way, it could continue indefinitely. Torn apart by horses. 4 horses were brought in, and all 4 of the convicts' limbs were attached to them individually. The horses were then whipped and would gallop and tear the offender's limbs straight out of their sockets. Sometimes the limbs were pre-cut to make it easier and faster. Other times, to prolong the torture, the horses would only stretch and dislocate the joints. Method 5. Torture by water. Boiling. The offender sentenced to this punishment would always be boiled alive. The practice predates the Roman Empire. Henry VIII chose boiling as a preferred punishment for poisoners. The Japanese prolonged the convicts' misery by dousing them with buckets of boiling water for several days. Ducking. This punishment was reserved for women. Prostitutes and shrewish women were tied to a chair or stool. 2 ropes were tied to it. The woman and the stool were heaved into the water and then dragged immediately to dry land. The point of this exercise was public humiliation. The idea was that after so much derision and jokes, the offending woman would hold her tongue from that day forward. Keel hauling. Keel hauling consisted of dragging the offender beneath a boat, along or across the keel, which is the backbone of the ship that runs underneath the hull. They would be hauled up the other side. This was a punishment for transgressing sailors. Potential hazards were having their flesh torn by barnacles that attached themselves to the bottom of the ship. If they were dragged too slowly, they could drown. Swimming. This was a method used to identify witches. The woman would be tied to a chair. Their hands and feet were bound, and they would be tossed into a lake or pond. The idea was that water, which is the source of life and the medium of Christian baptismal rites, was inherently holy. Therefore, it would reject anyone who sank to its depths. If a woman floated, she was assumed to be a witch and would be placed on trial, and usually sentenced to execution. If they sank and drowned, they were assumed to be innocent. Tormento de toca. Here comes the Spanish Inquisition again. The offender was strapped down, and a length of fine mesh cloth, usually linen, was stuffed down their throat and up their nostrils. They didn't stuff the nostrils with enough to suffocate him, but it was enough to make him panic. Once the cloth was in position, a fine stream of water was allowed to trickle onto the exposed parts of the cloth. This caused the moisture to be absorbed into their throat and nostrils. Once the victim nearly lost consciousness, the cloth was removed. The extracted cloth was usually soaked with blood. The sensation was said to be, quote, like pulling his bowels through his mouth. In another variation, a funnel was forced into the victim's throat. Large volumes of water were poured down their throat. The victim would begin to gag and vomit, but the pouring did not stop until the stomach was bloated and distended. The water would finally back up their throat and gush out of their mouth. Once their body was filled with as much water as it could hold, a noose was placed around his throat, or a gag was inserted into his mouth to prevent him from vomiting up the water. Once this procedure was finished, the torturer would remove him from the table and roll him back and forth across the dungeon floor, whereupon they would feel excruciating pain in their distended stomach. Eventually, the noose was removed, and the victim was allowed to vomit up the water. If they didn't die from a ruptured stomach, they were brought in for more questioning. Method 6. Torture by whipping. Different types of whips have been used in different ways, depending on the culture. In Egypt, whippings were carried out with bundles of reeds. In extreme cases, this resulted in the death of the victim due to a posthumous infection. They also used reeds in ancient Persia. This was never done to the point of death in Persia. The victim was whipped on the feet until the victim had a nervous breakdown. The plumete. This was a multi-thonged whip. Sometimes small lead balls were attached to the end of the thong. That or thorns or tiny slivers of sharp metal would be braided into the leather. This ensured the whipping was highly painful and physically damaging. Flagellum. This whip was designed by the Romans. It had the potential to tear the victim to pieces and was often used for this purpose. It was often used by gladiators. Chinese whippings. The Chinese made whips from lengths of split bamboo. Since it was heavy, the pain was excruciating, though the victim was never whipped to death with this instrument. The victim's back and upper thighs would be left with a mass of welts and blood blisters. In both China and Japan, the victim was laid face down on the ground before they were whipped. The Japanese designed these whips so that the sharp edges of the bamboo faced outward. The victim could receive as many as 150 lashings with this instrument, so their survival was not guaranteed. Medieval Europe. The victim was tied to a post in a public space. Sometimes the pain might be exacerbated when vinegar or salt was rubbed into the lacerations. As painful as that was, it protected the offender from infections. England. The subject was bound to the back of a cart with a length of rope. They would be led through the streets of the town and whipped for as long as it took to make the trip. They were whipped until they left a trail of blood behind them. The chain whip. This was a thick chain, and if it didn't break the skin, it was sure to break ribs, arms, and collarbones. The jailer's whip. This whip had a short, stout wooden handle, similar to that of the chain whip. It was fitted with a single 8 or 10-inch length of chain with a 4 to 6 ounce cast iron or lead weight at the end. It had the potential to crush a man's skull like a melon. The bullet whip. 2 or 3 dozen musket balls were sewn into a leather tube. They were then attached either to a wooden handle or a leather strap that could be looped around the user's wrist. Cat o' nine tails. This was a 9-pronged whip. Each thong was about 2.5 feet in length and had 2 or 3 knots along the length of the thong. The 9 braided tails cut through the skin. The knots ripped out hunks of flesh with every lash. Method 8. Exposure. The victim would be doused with cold water in the dead of winter and left outside to freeze to death. Either that, or in the middle of summer, they were covered with boiling water and oil, stripped naked, and left out in the sun, whereupon they burned to death. Honorable mentions: blinding with light, bone breaking, castration, Chinese water torture, combing, an iron comb that is normally used to prepare wool and other fibers for spinning would be used to scrape, tear, and flay the victim's flesh. Crushing. The victim is crushed beneath an immense weight. Sometimes this was done with the assistance of an elephant. Dehydration. Denailing. This consists of yanking all the fingernails and toenails from the victim in the most painful way possible. Disfigurement. This can be accomplished with many different tools. One modern method has been dealt to women in the Middle East who refused marriage proposals. They had acid thrown on their faces, which permanently distorted their features. Drowning. Enemas. Force feeding. This has frequently been employed as a reaction to hunger strikes. Foot roasting. Genital mutilation and forced circumcision. Hamstringing. The hamstrings of the victim are cut, making it difficult for the subject to walk. Pitch clapping. Hot pitch or tar was poured through a conical cap onto the victim's head. It was allowed to cool and then swiftly removed, bringing with it the offender's skin and tissue. Perilla. Torture by electric shock. Pressure points. In traditional Chinese medicine, Indian Ayurveda, and martial arts. The pressure points were taught as locations to inflict extreme pain due to the high concentration of nerve endings. Rape. Sexual assault has often been weaponized during times of war. Scathism. The victim was tied between two boats. They were fed and covered with milk and honey. They were allowed to fester and be eaten by insects and other vermin over a long period of time. Shrimp tie. This was a method used by the Japanese. The upper body was forced into a bent position. It would send a burning sensation throughout the body if it were left this way too long. Sensory overload. Examples are loud noise and bright lights to the point where long-term exposure leads to nervous overload. Shin bone crusher. Sleep deprivation. Starvation. Stoning. Tarring and feathering. Tickle torture. As benign as this sounds, if it is carried on long enough, a panic response will be elicited. Tooth extraction. Walling. Walling is an interrogation technique invented by the CIA. The victim's neck is encircled by a collar, which is used to slam the person against a wall. Waterboarding. This method has received a lot of attention in recent years. A cloth covers the victim's face and breathing passages. Water is poured over them to bring them to the point of drowning. Waterboarding can cause extreme pain, including damage to the lungs and brain. Bones can be broken in the process of struggling against it. It can also inflict psychological trauma. Drilling. This was an interrogation technique used by the Irish Republican Army. To force an adversary to surrender information, a power drill would be taken to their kneecaps. This is an excerpt from Amnesty International's statement on torture. Under international law, torture and other forms of ill treatment are always illegal. They have been outlawed internationally for decades. To take just a couple of examples, 172 countries have adhered to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which prohibits torture and other forms of ill treatment, and 165 countries are parties to the UN Convention Against Torture, which Amnesty International campaigned hard to create. But many states have failed to criminalize torture as a specific offense under their national laws, and governments around the world continue to defy international law by torturing people. Between January 2009 and May 2013, Amnesty International received reports of torture in 141 countries from every region of the world. Torture can never be justified. It is barbaric and inhumane, and replaces the rule of law with terror. No one is safe when governments allow its use. I'm going to leave you with a song. This is Iron Maiden by Iron Maiden. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.